The Zillo beast might be the single most dangerous thing the Sith ever underestimated. Out of all the horrors in Star Wars, it is the only creature that visibly unsettled Palpatine himself. And in this what if, that moment of fear turns into his downfall. One rampaging monster on Coruscant doesn't just crush a Chancellor, it cracks a 1,000-year Sith plan in half before the Empire can even be born. I thought it would be fun to take that brief Clone Wars arc and stretch it into a full alternate timeline. Not just a quick what if Order 66 never happened, but a step-by-step story that starts the second the Zillo beast escapes on Coruscant and follows the consequences out to the very end of the war. Now, there will be major spoilers for the Clone Wars and for Palpatine's grand design across the prequels. So, there's your warning. Now, let's get started with the key twist. We are staying inside canon events right up to the Zillo beast's second appearance in Season 2. The Republic has dragged this thing from Malastare to the heart of the galaxy. Palpatine has ordered it studied and, of course, quietly cloned for its lightsaber-proof armor. The Jedi are already uneasy. Anakin and Mace have just watched their lightsabers bounce off its scales. In the show, the beast dies under a bombardment. In our version, it breaks containment one step earlier and reaches the Chancellor's podium. In that chaos, there is no last-second rescue, no dramatic escape pod. The only being who can trigger Order 66 is crushed or incinerated right there in his own capital. The inhibitor chips in the clones are still waiting for a command that will never come. Darth Vader never gets forged on Mustafar. The Empire, as we know it, is cut off before it can fully form, leaving the galaxy with a war machine, but no secret puppet master to steer it. As I said, this isn't random fanfiction where we throw in a rancor for fun. The Zillo beast is already canonically immune to lightsabers and most heavy weapons, and Palpatine is already obsessed with turning its armor into the next generation of clone plating. He is the one who drags an ancient, force-resistant Titan into the most densely populated city in the galaxy. We are just asking what happens when that hubris pays off in the worst possible way. From there, we'll move in clear chronological order, almost episode by episode. We'll track how Dooku reacts when Sidious suddenly goes silent, how the Jedi Council handles a Republic that has lost its Chancellor and its hidden Sith threat at the same time, how Mas Amedda and the Senate scramble to seize control, and what the clones do once the war's ultimate command is gone. By the end, we'll see whether something Empire-like eventually rises, or if the galaxy takes a completely different path without the monster in the robes, or the monster he thought he could control. So to make this more than just a single cool moment on Coruscant, I thought it would be fun to treat this as a full alternate history project. Our structural promise for this video is simple. We're going to put the entire Zillo Beast Kills Palpatine timeline in order, from the first tremor on Malastare all the way to a decade after the Clone Wars, and track the political, military, and personal fallout step by step. That means we need a clear baseline. In canon, the Zillo Beast shows up in the Clone Wars Season 2. The Republic detonates an electro-proton bomb on Malastare, the ground collapses, and this ancient kaiju wakes up. They were told it was indestructible, and we see why. Blaster fire, artillery, even lightsabers barely scratch it. The Republic decides to capture it for study. Palpatine personally orders it brought to Coruscant, and of course that goes about as well as a gundark in a china shop. On Coruscant, the beast escapes, rampages through the city, and zeroes in on the Chancellor, seemingly sensing something wrong with him. In the original timeline, the Jedi and the military eventually bring it down with a massive toxin attack. Palpatine survives, then quietly commands the scientists to study and clone the creature for its armor. That secret order is our fork in the road. In our version, the Zillo beast actually reaches him first. So, as I said, the scope of this what-if is going to be wide, but organized. First, we'll cover the immediate 24 hours of chaos on Coruscant, the physical battle with the beast, the exact way Palpatine dies, who witnesses it, and how the news spreads through the Senate, the Jedi Temple, and the Separatist leadership. Then we'll look at the first unstable month, when Mas Amedda, Sly Moore, and the Senate scrambled to keep the war machine running without the man who secretly controlled both sides. From there, we'll zoom out to the remaining years of the Clone Wars without Darth Sidious pulling the strings. We'll follow Dooku's crisis of purpose when his master simply goes silent, Grievous's response when the war suddenly loses its grand design, and the clones realizing their inhibitor chips contain an order that no one can give. Eventually, we'll push a full decade past the armistice to see what long-term galactic settlement replaces the empire that never quite forms. Now, there will be major spoilers for the Clone Wars, Revenge of the Sith, and broad canon lore about Order 66, the chips, and Palpatine's political maneuvers. We're going to reference late series reveals as if everyone's already seen them. So, there's your warning. Now, let's get started by going back to where this all begins. The Malastire Arc, the electroproton bomb, and the moment the Republic decides it's a good idea to drag a lightsaber-proof monster straight to the galactic capital. Now that we're back on Malastare, we need to meet the real star of this alternate timeline, the Zillo beast. In the show, it's framed as a monster, but it's so much more than that. This thing is an ancient titan from Malastare's depths, a living fossil that shrugged off the electroproton bomb, tank shells, and even direct lightsaber strikes without flinching. Blasters scorched it, missiles annoyed it, but nothing really hurt it. That near indestructibility is exactly why Palpatine becomes obsessed. Publicly, he tells the Jedi Council he only wants to study the creature, to understand its biology and protect the Republic. Secretly, he's already thinking in terms of armor plating, mass production, and new weapons projects. By the time he orders it transported to Coruscant, he's talking in hushed tones with scientists about cloning the Zillo beast, peeling off scales, and wrapping the future of war in its hide. Of course, that future of war is really just his future empire. As I said, we have to re-establish who Palpatine is at this point. To the galaxy, he's the weary but benevolent Supreme Chancellor, reluctantly holding on to emergency powers while promising to give them up when the Clone Wars end. To us, now, he's Darth Sidious, already running both sides of the conflict, already meeting in the shadows with Dooku, and already putting the final pieces of Order 66 in place. Order 66 itself is baked into the clone's inhibitor chips, just waiting for one specific command from Sidious. He's grooming Anakin as his next apprentice, whispering about the dark side, the power to cheat death, all of that. I thought it would be fun to really underline this, because when the Zillo beast kills him, all of those threads snap at once. Meanwhile, the Jedi Council is in a terrible spot. They were peacekeepers turned generals almost overnight, forced to command legions of clones they don't fully understand. They're uneasy about Palpatine's growing authority. They're debating how long he should legally stay in office, but they still have no idea about the chips or the true scale of the Sith plot. From their perspective, the Chancellor is a problem politician, not the hidden Sith Lord. Surrounding Palpatine, we have his political inner circle, Masameda and Sly Moore. They were always there in the background of Senate scenes, looming over votes, whispering in the Chancellor's ear. If he dies suddenly during the Zillo Beast incident, they're perfectly positioned to either steady the Republic or hijack it before anyone realizes just how much power is up for grabs. On the other side, we've got the Separatist leadership. Count Dooku, as Darth Tyrannus, answers directly to Sidious, coordinating with General Grievous and the corporate titans of the CIS. They were following one grand design. When the Zillo Beast ends Sidious's life in our scenario, that chain of command is violently severed, and Dooku, Grievous, and the Senate all learn the news at different times. So, there's your warning. Once the Beast breaks loose on Coruscant, every one of these players is thrown into chaos, and the Clone Wars we know starts to unravel in a single night. Now, let's get started by rewinding to the canon Zillo Beast arc itself, because to change the timeline, we have to know the exact moment things went off the rails. As I said, this whole disaster begins far away from Coruscant, over the fuel-rich world of Malastare. The Republic is testing a brand new superweapon, the electroproton bomb, on Separatist tanks and droids dug in across the planet. They thought the most dangerous thing on that battlefield was the droid army, but when the bomb goes off, it does something else. It cracks open the bedrock and wakes up a legend. The Zillo Beast, this towering, Godzilla-style creature with indestructible armor plates, claws its way out of the pit and just shrugs off tanks and artillery. Layats strafe it, At-TEs blast it, and it barely notices. Anakin and Mace Windu are thrown into the middle of this, and the whole episode turns into a desperate kaiju hunt. They were riding speeders between its massive spines, trying to keep it away from the dug city while the clones on the ground are literally ants under its feet. Eventually, using energy cables, gas, and every trick they can improvise, they manage to subdue the beast without killing it, which is important for what comes next. Now, here's where Palpatine makes the choice that dooms him in our what if. Fascinated by that unbreakable armor, he overrides the Dug leadership and a lot of ethical objections from the Jedi and the Senate. He orders the Zillo beast transported to Coruscant for study, insisting that discovering its secrets could save clone lives and win the war. On paper, that sounds noble. In practice, we know it's the first step in trying to weaponize a living nightmare for his future empire. On Coruscant, things go from scientific to sadistic very fast. The beast is chained in a massive containment facility, flooded with gas, stabbed with probes, and clearly in agony. Of course, that does not go well. It snaps its restraints, smashes through the ceiling, and suddenly there's a skyscraper-sized monster rampaging through the galactic capital. We see it tearing through skylanes, swatting LA-AT gunships, and climbing towers while clones and Jedi scramble to contain it. Palpatine, in canon, plays both sides of this crisis. Publicly, he's the concerned Chancellor, authorizing evacuations and listening to the Jedi. Privately, he orders the beast's death, and then, in a chilling final scene, demands that it be cloned so its armor can be mass-produced. Now, there will be major spoilers for his long-term plan here, so there's your warning. That order is Sidious thinking decades ahead to stormtrooper armor, Death Star hulls, and a war machine no one can crack. Our divergence window is that chaotic chase across Coruscant. The Zillo beast is towering over the city. Palpatine is being shuttled between bunkers and viewing platforms, and every shot, every footstep could change history. That's the exact moment we're going to twist, and let the galaxy's most dangerous weapon collide with its most dangerous man. Now, let's get started right where we left off, in that nightmare version of Coruscant at night. The city is supposed to be the safe heart of the Republic, but right now it's sirens, searchlights, and screaming traffic lanes. The Zillo beast is clambering up toward the Senate district, every step shaking skyscrapers, while LA-AT gunships rake its armor with cannon fire that does almost nothing. Palpatine, of course, should be buried deep in a bunker. Instead, he insists on a closer observation post. I thought it would be fun to lean into his arrogance here. Mas Amedda, the Red Guard, even the pilots are arguing on the comms that this is too exposed, but the Chancellor wants to personally oversee the operation and study how the creature reacts to different weapons. So their shuttle and its escort gunships slide in, hovering near a thin support tower the beast is already using as a handhold. That's the critical mistake. From the clone's perspective in the escort, this is just another tight formation over a war zone. From ours, it's a disaster waiting to happen. The Zillo beast swings its tail, not aiming at Palpatine, just trying to swat away the stinging gunships. The impact slams into the tower instead. Durasteel buckles. Transparasteel windows explode outward. The whole spire tilts several degrees in one sickening motion. We watch as debris and ships spiral together. One escort LA-8 clips a falling platform and cartwheels into traffic, trailing fire. The other smashes into the listing tower and disintegrates. Palpatine's shuttle spins, engines screaming, slamming into the collapsing superstructure as the Zillo beast hauls itself higher. For a moment, the shuttle is pinned between a massive claw and the crumbling tower, crushed like a toy in a fist. Then the support gives way completely. In this timeline, there's no clever reveal, no hidden escape pod. The shuttle is shoved off the tower and drops, tumbling end over end into the lower levels. We stay with it just long enough to see it vanish into the abyss of Coruscant's Undercity. Then a distant, blooming fireball erupts far below. Clones on nearby platforms shield their visors from the glare. A Jedi strike team on a gunship sees it go down and calls for a rescue run, but the wreckage is already swallowed in smoke and falling debris. Now, there will be major spoilers for the rest of this video's timeline, so there's your warning. Security feeds cut to static mid-sentence. Mas Amedda loses the Chancellor's signal and starts shouting for confirmation that never comes. Red Guard squads report no visual. In the Force, Anakin and Mace both feel a jagged, senseless lurch, the kind you feel when a major life blinks out with no warning and no design behind it. As I said, Palpatine always thought he was the one playing the galaxy. Here, he dies as Palpatine, publicly and messily, his Sith identity still buried, his grand plan unfinished. No contingency. No execute Order 66, just a smoking crater in the depths of Coruscant and a power vacuum that's about to pull the Jedi, the Senate, and even Dooku into a completely different war. And the wild part is who finds out what first. So now we hit the moment the galaxy never prepared for. The Republic's war machine keeps moving, but the man at the center of the web is just gone. No contingency, no secret Sith backup plan, just 24 hours of pure shock on the most important planet in the timeline. In the Senate, it starts with confusion more than grief. Emergency sessions flare to life under flickering blue holoprojectors, delegates half-dressed, still smelling of smoke from the beast's rampage. Mas Amedda slams his staff again and again, trying to sound authoritative while 100 systems shout over each other. Some senators swear they saw separatist saboteurs near the transport site. Others whisper that Dooku hired an assassin to tamper with the containment fields. Rumors spread faster than official reports, and every rumor conveniently blames someone else. Mas Amedda leans on procedure because that's all he has. He calls for investigation committees, security reviews, temporary powers, but you can feel it. No one wants to be the first to say, "The Chancellor is dead," into the record. As I said, this is a republic built around one man's calm, reassuring hologram. Take that away, and those polished Senate pods suddenly feel very small and very exposed. While the politicians argue, the Jedi are split between crisis and questions. On the surface, Mace and Anakin are still doing the grim work, coordinating gunships, walkers, and sunned clones as they try to bring the Zillo beast down without leveling half of Coruscant. They were already struggling with its indestructible armor in the original episode, and now there's the added weight of knowing it just killed the head of state. Every missed shot feels heavier. Back in the temple, though, the council goes quiet instead of loud. Yoda, Plo Koon, Shock Tai. This is where they start asking how the most protected man in the Republic ended up standing within swiping distance of a creature that shrugs off lightsabers. I thought it would be fun to track the shift here. Publicly, they're the calm generals. Privately, they're starting an investigation. Was this negligence? Sabotage? Something stranger? Now, there will be major spoilers for how far that suspicion can go in later sections, so there's your warning. On the ground, the clones feel the chaos more than they understand it. Commanders like Rex and Cody get a blizzard of conflicting orders from panicked bureaucrats and stunned admirals. Pull back to guard the Senate. No, reinforce the temple. No, create a perimeter around the power grid. Their inhibitor chips sit dormant. There is no clear, cold execute Order 66 cutting through the noise, only a vague directive to protect the capital at all costs. For once, the clones are just soldiers in a disaster, not pieces in Sidious's long game. The Coruscant Guard, of course, gets hit hardest by the security vacuum. With Palpatine gone and no emergency successor yet, Fox and his officers move on instinct. They lock down the Senate complex, ring the temple in gunships, and turn key infrastructure into fortified islands of red armor and E5 blaster checks. Overnight, the Ecumenopolis looks less like a shining capital and more like a city under martial law, but there's no single civilian voice to say when this ends. By the time the beast finally falls, its massive form collapsing amid smoke, searchlights, and exhausted Jedi, the fires on Coruscant are still burning and the Holonet is already asking the question the Senate won't. In a republic suddenly without its Chancellor, who steps up to speak for billions? And when they do, are they going to walk the path Palpatine laid down, or try to break from it entirely? So while the Senate is still arguing over emergency powers and succession, somewhere far from Coruscant, something much quieter and much more terrifying happens. In the middle of hyperspace, Count Dooku straightens, the meditation in his solar sailor shattering as the Force slams into him like an explosion. He's felt death before. He's caused plenty of it. But this is different. There's no elegant clash of blades, no sense of a duel between masters. What rips through him now is raw, animalistic fury, a storm of pain, confusion, and the echo of a roar that is not human. Then, abruptly, the presence that has sat in the back of his mind for years, the cold, calculating will of Darth Sidious, simply vanishes. As I said, Dooku is not a man who panics. The very next thing he does is pull up secure channels and start freezing pieces of Sidious's grand design. Coordinated offensives that were meant to bleed the Outer Rim and push the Republic toward more security powers? Delayed. A planned Republic victory that was actually staged to justify new clone production? Quietly cancelled. He knows the invisible hand guiding both sides is gone, and if he moves too boldly now, the Jedi might finally notice there was a hand at all. On the Separatist side, of course, the news hits very differently. General Grievous receives the report as a tactical update. The Supreme Chancellor of the Republic is dead, killed during some kind of containment disaster. To him, it's target neutralized, war goal advanced. On the CIS Council holofeed, Neimoidian voices crackle with glee. Banking clan reps talk interest rates, and they were already drafting propaganda about the corrupt Republic tearing itself apart. Dooku plays his part. He appears calm, even pleased, presenting this as the moment their movement has been fighting for. The Republic is leaderless, the Jedi are overextended, and now, he tells them, is when the Confederacy proves it can offer order instead of chaos. I thought it would be fun to imagine the contrast here. On one side of the holocall, Grievous is practically quoting, "Time to finish this war," while on the other, Dooku is quietly realizing the war's architect is Ash. But when the transmission ends, the mask slips. Alone, he turns over his options. Does he simply continue Sidious's timeline on his own, pushing for the slow strangulation of the Republic until some new empire can be declared under a different name? Does he reach out through the shadows, trying to feel for another dark presence strong enough to replace his master? Or, now that the puppet master is gone, does he consider the unthinkable? That negotiation with the Jedi might actually achieve the reforms he once genuinely wanted? Now, there will be major spoilers for Dooku's character here, so there's your warning. Without Sidious's iron will pressing on his mind, the old Count of Sereno starts to surface. The disillusioned Jedi who left because the Republic was corrupt. The idealist who believed the Outer Rim deserved better than being strip-mined by corporations. Those motives have been twisted by years steeped in the dark side, but they don't disappear. They complicate everything. And as the ripples of Sidious's death spread, Dooku realizes something else. If the Jedi ever connect the Chancellor's fall, the war's strange patterns, and his own secret role, he won't just be a political enemy, he'll be the final loose link in a broken Sith chain. So what does a Sith Lord do when he's suddenly the last one standing, and when both the Republic and the Separatists might be about to turn on him at the same time? So while Dooku is suddenly staring into the abyss, the Republic is too. And in that instant, one person steps into the blinding spotlight on Coruscant, Mas Amedda. Now, Mas Amedda isn't a warrior, he's not a Jedi, and he's definitely not a Sith mastermind. He is, however, the Vice Chair of the Galactic Senate and Palpatine's longest-serving ally. In the Republic's legal timeline of succession, that makes him the highest-ranking official still breathing. So, before the smoke from the Zillo Beast's rampage has even cleared, Maz has a pretext to do the one thing the galaxy is begging for: declare himself interim authority, just to keep the machinery moving. He moves fast. We cut to his first public address, broadcast from the same podium where Palpatine once promised, "I will not let this republic that has stood for 1,000 years be split in two." Now, there will be major spoilers for how that line ages here, so there's your warning. Mas appears draped in mourning colors, Leku ornaments dimmed, voice low and deliberate. He mourns our beloved Chancellor, condemns separatist aggression, and vows that elections will be held when the crisis passes. The message is simple: stay calm, stay loyal, the war effort continues. But the real story is happening off-camera. Right after the speech, Maz retreats into shadowed conference rooms with Sly Moore, Coruscant Guard commanders, and intelligence chiefs. Doors seal. Holograms flicker. They were not plotting a Sith empire. They were scrambling just to lock down information. Who knows the Chancellor is dead? How badly did security fail? Can they spin the Zillo disaster as a separatist bioweapon? I thought it would be fun to highlight that contrast. The calm, scripted Mas Amedda the public sees versus the panicked operator trying to keep a billion-system government from tearing itself apart. And here's the crucial thing. Maz has no idea he's been standing next to Darth Sidious this whole time. As I said, he's a political creature, not a dark side acolyte. He doesn't know about Order 66, the inhibitor chips, or any hidden command phrase that can flip the clones from heroes to executioners. His instinct is conservative in the small c sense. Preserve the Senate, preserve the courts, preserve the chain of command. He wants to win the war, not overthrow the system. That's where the Jedi come in. Mas has always been wary of their influence. To him, they're powerful, unelected generals who talk to the Force more than they talk to committees. But he doesn't share Palpatine's hatred. Now, let's get started on this political tightrope. Within hours, he's inviting the Jedi Council into emergency governance talks, proposing a joint crisis committee, Jedi, key senators, and his own office working together. In the rotunda, some senators whisper that the clones and their Jedi commanders should just assume direct control until new elections. In private, others quote those old Coruscant jokes about letting the laser sword monks run everything, with a nervous laugh. That's our pattern interrupt moment. The war that was designed to end the Republic now forces it to lean harder on the very guardians the Sith meant to destroy. And as days pass, fault lines appear. One bloc rallies around Mas Amedda as a caretaker, arguing that continuity is the only way to keep separatist fleets from smashing through the mid-rim. Another bloc demands a new strong Chancellor immediately. Someone who can be our new Valorum, but with a spine. And then there's the radical wing, already drafting proposals to demilitarize, wind down the clone army, and strip the executive of the emergency powers Palpatine hoarded. By the time the Zillo Beast's corpse is hauled away for study, the real monster is the power struggle taking shape in the Senate. And out on the front lines, millions of clones and their Jedi generals are waiting to see which version of the Republic they're actually fighting for now. So while the Senate tears itself apart over who actually runs the Republic now, the Jedi are having their own civil war in miniature. The council chamber is in emergency session, and this time it is not some distant episode on Ryloth or Umbara they are debating. It is the offer Mas Amedda has just placed on the table: share power or watch the Republic spiral. Now let's get started with that scene, because it's one of those moments where you really see what the Jedi are at their core. They were supposed to be peacekeepers, not politicians. But with the Chancellorship effectively decapitated, Amedda is proposing a provisional directorate, senior senators plus the Jedi Council, jointly guiding policy and security until elections can be organized. On paper, it sounds almost reasonable. In practice, it's the Jedi standing one step away from ruling the galaxy. Mace Windu is the first to cut through the polite phrasing. As I said, he's the one who was already suspicious of Palpatine in canon, and here that instinct is dialed up. He points out that the Zillo Beast's rampage was too convenient, that security lapses on Coruscant do not just happen around the most guarded man in the Republic. He pushes for a much more active Jedi role in investigating the Chancellor's death, rooting out whoever benefited, and overseeing the military so the clones are not used as someone else's pawns again. But even Mace draws a hard line. The Jedi taking the Chancellorship outright would cross a boundary they cannot uncross. Yoda, of course, goes even further. This is where we really feel the echo of his canon misgivings. He reminds the Council that every step toward formal authority pulls the Order away from the Force, and toward fear, bureaucracy, and control. He warns that if they sit on a ruling council today, they will be tempted to hold onto it tomorrow when new crises come up. In other words, trading one potential emperor for 12 robed ones is not an upgrade. Then there is Anakin. Now, there will be major spoilers for his emotional state here, so there's your warning. Anakin is wrecked. In this timeline, Palpatine died not as a revealed Sith Master, but as a mentor who always seemed to understand him. Anakin feels abandoned by the universe, furious that the Council talks about procedure while the war still rages and the man who believed in him is dead. Part of him wants the Jedi to seize control so things finally make sense. Another part is so disgusted by the indecision that he starts thinking about walking his own path. Without Sidious whispering in his ear, that fork in the road is still open. The compromise they reach is careful, and honestly, it's the kind of thing I thought it would be fun to map out in this timeline. The Jedi refuse the Chancellorship, but they do not retreat to pure neutrality. Instead, they agree to form a provisional joint security council with Mas Amedda and key senators from major blocs. The Jedi will have enhanced advisory and investigative powers, direct access to clone deployments, and a mandate to probe corruption around Palpatine's death, but they stop short of ruling. For now. And that, for now, is what's going to matter as the war, and Anakin's arc keep unfolding. For now, the Jedi and the Senate are trying to hold the Republic together without a Supreme Chancellor. But there's something far more dangerous than a political vacuum sitting quietly in every barracks, on every Venator, riding shotgun with every Jedi general. The real shadow of Sidious isn't his old office on Coruscant. It's the tiny sliver of Kaminoan biotech inside every clone's brain. As I said, canon tells us that every single clone trooper carries an inhibitor chip. It's not just a behavioral nudge, it's a hardwired command structure with things like Order 66 pre-programmed from day one. That infamous order is not a phrase on a datapad, it's a specific activation protocol only Darth Sidious knows how to trigger. A verbal and coded key that no one else in the galaxy has. With Palpatine dead under the Zillo Beast's claws, that key dies with him. Now, there will be major spoilers for arcs like Fives and Tup, so there's your warning. In the original timeline, the Kaminoans hide the chips behind layers of secrecy, encrypted contracts, and very careful language about inhibiting aggressive tendencies. Lama Su and Nala Se report directly to Sidious through Tyrannus, not to the Senate, not even to Ma Sameda. The Jedi sign off on the clone program, but no one ever says, "Oh, by the way, we put a secret kill switch in your entire army." That's still true here. The only difference is that the man who planned to flip it is now a smear on the Coruscant skyline. So on the surface, nothing changes. The clones are still the Republic's most loyal soldiers. They were bred to follow orders. They call their Jedi Sir and General, and they share those little squad jokes we know from the show. We still get commanders like Cody and Bly building real friendships with Obi-Wan and Ayla. Without the looming certainty of betrayal, those bonds only deepen. Anakin and Rex, Plo Koon and the Wolfpack, Luminara and Gree, all keep stacking missions on their shared timeline of trust. But the chips don't disappear just because Sidious does. Now, let's get started on the weird part. We know from the Tup incident that under stress, a chip can misfire. In this timeline, we still have clones waking up with splitting headaches, momentary blackouts, or flashes of something they don't understand. A trooper on Umbara freezes with his rifle aimed at a Jedi silhouette. A medic on Kamino notices abnormal brain scans but can't explain them. Without Sidious to call Nala Se and say cover this up, those anomalies don't get quietly erased. I thought it would be fun to really sit with that. If the war drags on and these incidents ramp up, the Jedi now have investigative authority and a mandate to probe Kamino. Do they uncover the chips in time? And when the clones finally learn they were manufactured with a hidden order to slaughter the very generals they love, what does that do to their sense of self? To their loyalty? To the entire idea of being a good soldier who follows orders? When the next order might be the one that breaks them? Now, let's get started with what the galaxy actually feels like in that first month without its secret Grand Puppet Master. On the surface, not much changes. Ma Sameda steps up in front of the Senate, voice echoing through the same chamber we've seen 100 times, and insists on continuity. The emergency powers stay. The war effort stays. Committees rebrand themselves as a provisional council, but they were already rubber-stamping Palpatine's agenda, so it feels familiar. The one real shift is that they immediately commission inquiries, one into the Zillo Beast incident itself, and another into how security on Coruscant failed so badly that the Chancellor died in his own capital. Those inquiries are where the Jedi quietly slide in. As I said, they now have investigative authority, so masters like Shakti and Plo Koon suddenly have legal cover to poke into Kaminoan contracts, while also sitting in on security briefings about the beast. Publicly, it's about making sure this tragedy never happens again. Privately, it's the Council testing how much of Palpatine's old power web still exists without him pulling the strings. Out in Separatist space, the tone is very different. Count Dooku feels the break first. That constant precise pressure from Sidious just stops. No more detailed instructions about which planet to hit to pressure a specific senator, no more bizarre orders to deliberately lose a battle so a bill will pass on Coruscant. So Dooku and Grievous fall back on what they know, conventional warfare. They target shipyards, fuel depots, hyperspace lanes. The droid armies still hit hard, but the attacks are less synchronized, less theatrical. Clone commanders notice it almost immediately. Instead of elaborate feints that turn into meat grinder traps, enemy offensives feel like straightforward assaults. Think of Umbara in the original timeline, where every ridge and shadow was part of some larger design to break the clones and the Jedi. In this version, those catastrophic ambushes just don't line up as often. Rex and Cody still lose men, of course, but they're not walking into perfectly timed crossfires on 3 fronts. That difference gives the troops small but very real morale boosts. Now, there will be major spoilers for just how both sides spin Palpatine's death in the information war, so there's your warning. Republic media leans hard into the narrative of separatist terror. The Chancellor died defending Coruscant from a monster unleashed by our enemies. HoloNews runs endless footage of the Zillo beast rampaging through skylanes while senators promise justice. CIS broadcasts flip it. To them, this is proof the Republic can't even protect its own leader, and proof that Coruscant is vulnerable. One separatist commentator even quips, "If one beast can do this, what hope do their clones have against a united front?" I thought it would be fun to point out that this is the first time in the war where the horror curve actually flattens a bit. The fighting continues, but without Sidious's orchestration, the edges are duller, the body count slightly less engineered. That uneasy stability creates just enough breathing room for those Camino investigations to dig deeper, and for Dooku to start wondering who, exactly, he's really been serving. Which is where our timeline takes its next sharp turn. That sharp turn doesn't just hit politics and the war. It hits the poor Zillo beast, too. For all the terror it caused, the creature's own timeline ends brutally fast. Once Palpatine is dead, and the illusion of control shatters, the clones on Coruscant do what they were trained to do. They bring overwhelming firepower. Gunships, walkers, artillery from rooftop batteries, even experimental ordnance that was supposed to be for testing only, all get greenlit in a single panicked hour. The beast, which was already sedated and tortured in our original episode, goes down roaring under a storm of turbolaser fire. Its armor holds for a while, but sustained barrages finally crack plates, pierce joints, and overload its nervous system. It collapses against the Senate District skyline, leaving this impossible silhouette of a dead god beast slumped over the very institutions that captured it. So, there's your warning. The thing that killed the Sith Master doesn't get a heroic send-off. It becomes a war crime scene. Now let's get started on what happens next, because the aftermath is where the science and ethics really collide. As I said, the instant the guns go quiet, the scientists move in. The same Republic and Kaminoan teams who were dissecting the beast under Palpatine's secret orders are suddenly answering to someone else. A joint Jedi Senate Ethics Committee forms almost overnight, chaired by people like Shaak Ti and a few very shaken senators who watched the Chancellor die on live HoloNet. They lock down the labs, seize Palpatine's personal files, and start rewriting the rules. No more unconsented torture of sentient creatures, no more weaponization first, questions later. But the war is still on, and those scales are still basically lightsaber-proof. So the research doesn't stop. It just changes tone. Instead of clone killer armor for some future empire, the official line becomes defensive applications only. Starfighter plating, bunker shielding, maybe reinforced gunship hulls to keep more clones alive. The cloning project is where things get really radioactive. Without Palpatine personally whispering in ears, the phrase mass-producing Zillo beasts is political poison. Senators from worlds that watch the rampage are on the floor quoting Coruscant guards. "Sir, that thing ate a tank." Publicly, the program is shelved, archived, and stamped with so many classified seals you can barely read the title. Privately, a few vials of genetic material and some partial growth models stay on Camino under contingency budgets. Culturally, the beast becomes a mirror. On some worlds, it's a straight-up cautionary tale about hubris. Teachers tell kids the story of the Chancellor who thought he could chain a monster and ended up in its fist. On more jaded core worlds, it turns into a dark joke. The Republic's greatest leader, taken out by his own secret weapon. You can almost hear Coruscant late-night hosts doing their best Houthis impression. So, the approval ratings really tanked, huh? And through all of this, fragments of Zillo armor and encrypted research files get boxed up and buried in archives. Jedi archivists sign off on security protocols, the Senate Ethics Committee writes a stern report, and everyone feels responsible. But we know how this galaxy works. Eventually regimes change, records are reclassified, And some ambitious admiral or rogue Sith successor is going to open a forgotten vault and see those indestructible scales. I thought it would be fun to tease that now, because when the war shifts again, those dormant projects are going to matter a lot more than the Jedi anticipate. So, with those dormant Zillo projects quietly humming away in the background, we have to zoom in on the person who's about to feel this loss the hardest: Anakin Skywalker. Palpatine doesn't just vanish from the galactic timeline, he vanishes from Anakin's life as the one authority figure who constantly told him he was right to feel afraid, right to want more, right to distrust the Council. In this version of the Coruscant attack, the news hits Anakin on the front lines. One moment, the Chancellor is the steady voice he can call from the war room. The next, reports say the meteor that crushed part of the Senate district was actually the Zillo beast, and Palpatine was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Anakin's grief is messy. He's furious that such a random, senseless death could take a man he saw as a mentor. There's no Sith lightning, no revelation, just rubble and a body he never gets to say goodbye to. Now, there will be major spoilers for Anakin's usual fall, so there's your warning. In canon, Sidious takes all that fear of loss and sharpens it into a weapon. Here, that knife never gets forged. Anakin is still waking up from nightmares of Padme dying, still replaying his mother's death on Tatooine, but there's no quiet voice in his office whispering about forbidden powers, plagues, or how the dark side can save the ones you love. The vulnerabilities are still there. They were always there. They just aren't being fed, stoked, and rewarded. Into that vacuum steps Padme. As I said, she's always been his moral compass, but now she becomes his main emotional anchor. Instead of confiding in the Chancellor about how broken the Republic is, Anakin finds himself on Padme's balcony, ranting that the Senate is paralyzed without Palpatine, that the war is dragging on, that nothing changes. Padme doesn't tell him to burn it all down. She tells him to help her reform it. I thought it would be fun to imagine those late-night planning sessions where the aggressive negotiations jokes from the films turn into actual proposals, anti-corruption committees, clone veterans' rights, emergency powers being rolled back instead of expanded. At the same time, the Jedi Council is forced into more transparency. With no Supreme Chancellor playing both sides, they're pulled directly into shared governance, and Anakin suddenly hears the full weight of their dilemmas. He still hates being kept at arm's length, still chafes under Mace's caution, but now he's in the room for more of the hard conversations. That alone takes a bit of the sting out of his alienation. Now, let's get started on the hard truth. Anakin is still volatile, still the most dangerous knight in the Order. Without Order 66, without Mustafar, the Vader armor never arrives on schedule, but the question becomes even scarier. Without a master manipulator steering him, does he grow into the Republic's greatest guardian? Or does some future crisis finally tip him over the edge? Because the galaxy hasn't seen its last catastrophe yet. So, if Anakin is this unstable superweapon without a handler, what does that mean for the other apprentice in Sidious's life? Now, let's get started with the man who actually knew he was in a Sith apprenticeship, Count Dooku. Dooku's whole timeline is built on disillusionment. He was once a respected Jedi Master, trained by Yoda, a war hero and diplomat who saw the Senate rotting from the inside. The corruption on worlds like Sereno and the constant compromise in the Republic pushed him away. When Sidious offered him the mantle of Darth Tyrannus, Dooku thought a strong hand could reshape the galaxy. Of course, that strong hand turned out to be someone else's. As I said, he traded a broken system for outright darkness. Now we drop into his private chambers after the Zillo beast kills Palpatine. The war is still raging, Grievous is still out there, the droids are marching, but the holocom that used to flare to life with Sidious's hooded image stays dark. Dooku meditates in that cold, red-lit lair, feeling for the familiar presence in the dark side, and there's just a void. For a man who left the Jedi chasing order, that silence is terrifying. Did the dark side abandon him, or did his master simply die as meaninglessly as any other politician crushed under debris on Coruscant? Here's the pattern interrupt. Dooku has what is basically a Sith crisis of faith. We're used to him being the composed mastermind, trading barbs with Obi-Wan and quoting, "I have become more powerful than any Jedi." But alone, he has to ask whether the dark side actually offers a path to order without Sidious's grand design. Without that hidden plan, is he just another warlord leading an army of droids and desperate systems toward endless chaos? Strategically, his options are brutal, but clear. He could try to assume the mantle of Dark Lord himself, declaring to the Separatist Council that Sidious's will now flows through him. He could vanish into the archives of places like Korriban and Moraband, hunting ancient Sith teachings to fill the void, hoping some holocron will tell him what comes next. Or he could do something far more dangerous to his own identity. Quietly start laying the groundwork for a negotiated end to the war, on terms that preserve Separatist autonomy and his own power, without admitting that the puppet master is gone. That's where the tension with Grievous and the CIS Council really spikes. They were expecting a redoubled offensive after the Chancellor's death, a full-scale push on Coruscant to finish the clones and the Jedi, while the Senate panics. Instead, Dooku becomes cautious, probing, even contemplative. Grievous mocks this Jedi hesitation, while corporate leaders demand results. Dooku's reluctance to throw droid armies into meat grinder assaults makes them wonder if he's lost his edge. I thought it would be fun to twist the knife one more turn. Dooku doesn't just brood, he starts reaching out. Back-channel messages slip toward disaffected senators who once agreed with his critiques of corruption. Old Jedi acquaintances who left the Order, or who argued for reform, suddenly find subtle separatist envoys sounding them out. Now, there will be major spoilers for where this could go later in the war, so there's your warning. But this is where we see the possibility of a shocking proposal. A Sith apprentice, cut loose, considering peace not as surrender, but as his final move to reshape the galaxy on his own terms. Because if Dooku starts thinking that way, he's not the only one who has to reconsider their loyalties. So while Dooku is quietly rethinking the entire war from the shadows, the public face of the Republic is melting down in real time. The Chancellor is dead, killed not by a Sith assassin or separatist superweapon, but by the very creature he brought to Coruscant. Now, let's get started on what that does to the Senate. The emergency powers Palpatine stacked up over the course of the war suddenly look a lot less abstract when there's no Palpatine to wield them. Padme Amidala, Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, and that whole reformist squad realize this is their moment. They were already the ones giving those quiet speeches about liberty in the middle of clone parades. Now they stand up and say, in effect, if one man can grab this much control, the problem isn't just the man, it's the powers themselves. I thought it would be fun to really picture those first emergency sessions after the Zillo Beast attack. The Senate chamber is half rubble. Masameda is literally shouting over repair droids, and you've got Warhawks arguing that the only thing more dangerous than a dead Chancellor is a weak replacement. They point to the chaos on Coruscant, the still-raging Clone Wars, and say the Republic needs a single strong hand, or it will fracture overnight. On the other side, Padme reads out the list of decrees Palpatine pushed through. Direct control over the Grand Army, reduced judicial oversight, secret appropriations for special weapons research, that of course just blew up in everyone's face. Bail and Mon Mothma back her up, arguing that no successor, not even a temporary one, should be allowed to inherit that entire toolbox. As I said, the debate stops being theoretical the moment senators remember they were almost crushed by a monster bred out of one of those classified projects. Masameda sees the danger. If he lunges for everything, he looks like he's trying to crown himself the next dictator. So he offers a compromise. Some emergency measures become fully codified wartime law. With clear Senate oversight, the centralized command of the clones stays. The ability to fast-track military funding stays. But the most sweeping, open-ended powers get sunset clauses. No more permanent, for the duration of the crisis language. Everything expires unless actively renewed. Behind the scenes, the Jedi Council quietly nudges things in the same direction. They don't know the full Sith plot, but they've felt the dark side wrapped around the Chancellor's office for years. Yoda and Mace support trimming back surveillance, curbing secret arrests, and limiting how often the army can be deployed on purely political worlds. The result is a partial victory. The Republic is still a wartime state, still marching clones and building destroyers, but the legal path Palpatine was carving toward an empire gets broken up. No one can just say, execute Order 66 and transform the whole system overnight. Of course, that doesn't mean the war suddenly becomes clean or simple, and the people who lose the most power here are already looking for other ways to win. Without Sidious steering every engagement, the war on the ground starts to feel very different. I thought it would be fun to zoom in on that, because this is where we really see how much of the Clone Wars was one Sith Lord's personal meat grinder rather than a normal galactic conflict. In canon, we get campaigns like Umbara, where the 501st is thrown into a nightmare on purpose. Krell's strategy is to grind clones down, turn them against each other, and see who follows orders when everything feels wrong. That kind of Jedi-on-Jedi manipulation needs Sidious in the background, rewarding monsters and protecting them from consequences. In this timeline, Krell is still ruthless, but there's no Sith Master promising him power. The Council is less distracted, more unified, and far quicker to pull a general who racks up casualties for glory instead of results. So the big shift is that battles stop being secret morality tests and start being battles. Separatist offensives become more conventional. Dooku and Grievous lean hard into what they understand, hitting resource worlds, key shipyards, and communications hubs, rather than elaborate multi-front distractions designed to smear the Jedi in the Senate. As I said, Sidious loved those layered operations where a victory on the map was actually a loss for the Order's reputation. With him gone, there's no one insisting that Ryloth also has to double as a propaganda trap. That change bleeds right into clone morale. Units like the 501st and the 212th are still thrown into brutal fighting, of course, but they're not being marched into obviously suicidal corridors just to see if they'll obey. Fewer hold this position until everyone dies, orders. More fall back, regroup, and hit them from the flank. Over time, that means less fatalism in the ranks. They were always brave. Now they start to feel less like disposable assets, and more like a professional army whose lives matter to the people in charge. Jedi survival rates tick up for the same reason. The war is still vicious, but the Council isn't being systematically maneuvered into no-win scenarios by a hidden Sith mastermind. There's no Geonosis-style arena repeat where the whole Order is nearly wiped out in one stroke, because no one is trying to engineer that moment. Now, there will be major spoilers for some early war episodes, so there's your warning. Take Christophsis. In our new timeline, the siege is still desperate, but instead of being a carefully staged stress test for Anakin and Obi-Wan, it's a straightforward push to hold a crystal supply line. The clones set proper kill zones, the Jedi coordinate artillery and air support, and when the Separatists overextend, Rex leads a counterattack that breaks their line. The Republic wins through strategy and bravery, not by playing into Sidious's long game. And that one cleaner victory hints at something much bigger that's about to happen on the grand strategic level. That cleaner victory doesn't just change the battle, it quietly changes the clones. Because in this timeline, without Sidious pulling every string, the first crack in the inhibitor chip system doesn't get buried. It hits the front lines in the most terrifying way possible for a soldier. Mid-war, we're on a nameless mudball where a brigade of clones and their Jedi general are holding a ridge against droids and artillery. It's loud, chaotic, the kind of episode where blaster bolts never stop. One trooper in a tight-knit squad, CT-4911, has been rock-solid all campaign. Then, in the middle of a push, he suddenly drops to one knee, clutching his helmet. The pain is blinding. He sees flashes, his own hands raising a rifle at his Jedi, his brothers firing in unison, a calm voice in his head ordering, "Execute." He freezes at the worst possible second. The Jedi calls for covering fire, the squad moves, but 4911 just stands there, shaking. A tank shell slams close, throwing clones through the air. Medics drag him behind the line, while he's babbling that he almost shot his general. The Jedi reaches out through the Force and feels it. Not simple fear, but a tangled knot of command phrases, dread, and something that feels disturbingly programmed. On paper, the commanders file it as combat stress. They were trained to expect that, but the way this clone keeps repeating that he saw the future, that he felt forced to do it, lodges in everyone's mind. As I said, this isn't just a trooper cracking under pressure. Even the battle-hardened captain walks away from the debrief looking unsettled. Now, there will be major spoilers for the chip plot in the Clone Wars, so there's your warning, because without Sidious alive to send secret orders, the Republic Medical Corps actually starts doing its job. CT-4911 is shipped to a secure med center, not a back alley facility. Neurologists, temple healers, and Kaminoan consultants all get called in. Scans show odd, repeating energy spikes deep in his brain, patterns that don't match standard clone conditioning or regular trauma. The Kaminoans are immediately evasive. Nalasi-type specialists call it a rare defect, a statistical outlier in an otherwise perfect template. They cite contractual secrecy with the Prime Minister. They insist it has nothing to do with the wider clone army. That corporate tone, that calm dismissal, only makes the Jedi more suspicious. Shaak Ti remembers Kamino. She remembers how much they weren't told. Then we get a pattern interrupt. One temple healer quietly notes that the anomaly's placement is identical across several random clones they test. Not just 4911, identical. Now let's get started on the real conspiracy. In this version of the timeline, the Jedi Council doesn't shrug and move on. Behind closed doors, Yoda and Plo Koon authorize a confidential task force. Think 5-style investigators paired with Jedi healers, quietly sampling brain scans, cross-checking battle reports, and tracing every path back to Kamino. They don't know about inhibitor chips yet, but the hunt has officially begun. And the clone's greatest secret is suddenly on a collision course with the Jedi Order. That quiet task force is the spark, but the real turning point comes when the Jedi decide they can't just chase rumors from a Coruscant medbay. They have to go straight to the source. So, there's your warning. We're heading back to Kamino, and this time it's not for a fun training montage or a Defense of the Squad episode. It's an audit. The Council and the Senate put together a high-level delegation that looks perfectly normal on paper. Shaak Ti returns, of course, as the Jedi who knows Kamino and the clones best. She's joined by Plo Koon, a few senior senators from key defense committees, and a team of Republic auditors who usually spend their days buried in supply reports. Officially, they're there to review war readiness and production quotas. Unofficially, Yoda and Plo give them a second mandate. Find out what the Kaminoans have been hiding since the first batch left the vats. Now, let's get started with how Kamino reacts, because this is where the tension really shows. Lama Su greets them with that same smooth politeness we saw when Obi-Wan first arrived in Attack of the Clones. He walks them past endless ranks of troopers, talks about efficiency, casualty replacement rates, and how the Republic's investment is performing. Nala Se stays close to the medical wings, her tone clinical as ever. Whenever anyone pushes, they fall back on contracts. They were commissioned by the late Chancellor, the genetic template was approved, the behavioral matrices were signed off. Any attempt to alter or inspect core protocols now, Lama Su implies, would violate the Republic's own agreements. So the delegation starts playing a double game. The auditors dive into financials and logistics, tracing obscure line items for neurostability assurance and contingency compliance, buried under armor refits and starship fuel. Shaak Ti and Plo walk the training halls, using the Force in subtle ways, feeling for flashes of fear or static where a mind should be clear. Clone officers, who trust the Jedi after years on the front, quietly pull their brothers aside and ask if anyone has ever blacked out in combat, heard phantom orders, or woken up in the medbay with no memory of how they got there. They don't uncover Order 66 by name, but they get close enough to be scared. Auditors flag encrypted subroutines tied to every clone's medical file, locked behind Kaminoan biotech codes. Nala Se admits, under pressure, that behavioral modification exists to prevent large-scale insubordination, but frames it as a safety feature. A few troopers report strange headaches near certain transmitters. To Shaak Ti, it all feels wrong, like a battle meditation running in reverse. When the delegation returns to Coruscant, the mood in the Jedi Council chamber shifts. As I said, they always knew the clones were engineered, but now they're convinced there are hidden contingencies they never approved. And with Palpatine dead, there's no single mastermind to blame. They vow to keep digging, even as new battlefronts open and the war pulls them away from the one place they most need to watch. the Kaminoan production lines that are still quietly churning out the future of the galaxy. The Kaminoans keep quietly churning out clones, the war keeps grinding on, and now something really wild happens in this new timeline. With Sidious gone and no Secret Order 66 switch to throw, Count Dooku is fighting a war that suddenly has no grand finale. Months pass, campaigns stall, fleets are shattered and rebuilt. Both sides are bleeding credits, ships, and soldiers for territory that keeps changing hands. Dooku is too smart not to notice. Without his master's apocalyptic endgame, all this destruction risks leaving nothing worth ruling. So there's your warning. This is where our story takes a sharp turn. I thought it would be fun to explore what happens when Dooku decides that reshaping the galaxy might work better through negotiation than annihilation. He doesn't send a holocall to the entire Senate, of course. Instead, we get something much quieter. Through a chain of intermediaries, disillusioned senators from neutral systems, corporate figures who are tired of sanctions, even a former Republic ambassador now living in separatist space, Dooku releases a single, encrypted message. It isn't framed as surrender, it's framed as survival, mutual de-escalation, limited ceasefires, a promise to discuss withdrawing droids from certain sectors if the Republic pulls back its clones. Now, let's get started on how that lands on Coruscant. The Provisional Council, already nervous about Kamino and the inhibitor chips, is split the moment the message plays. Some see only a trap. Masameda and the hardliners argue that Dooku is just buying time for Grievous, quoting all the times he's lied before. But reformists like Padme and Bail latch onto the smallest details: the specificity of the proposed demilitarized zones, the acknowledgement of civilian suffering on both sides, even Dooku's admission that this war was engineered by cowards who now lie dead. As I said, that line hits hard because they were literally just talking about hidden contingencies. Now, there will be major spoilers for how the Jedi respond to this. In the council chamber, the debate is just as intense. Mace Windu hears the offer and immediately focuses on the danger. Dooku is still a Sith Lord. He still commands legions of battle droids. Mace argues that entertaining this could legitimize every atrocity committed so far. Yoda, though, senses something else. The dark side still coils around Dooku, but there is a fracture, a genuine conflict that wasn't there when Sidious was alive. Obi-Wan, who's been chasing Dooku since Geonosis, backs Yoda. He remembers the moment Dooku told him a Sith controlled the Senate. If Dooku was partly telling the truth, then could he be partly sincere now? Eventually, they reach a compromise. A deniable delegation. No official treaty team, no public announcement. Just a small shuttle, a handful of clones for security, Obi-Wan as the Jedi representative, and one trusted senator, Padme, heading to a remote, neutral moon on the edge of Separatist space. They drop out of hyperspace to find a single Separatist cruiser already waiting. Its hangar doors open, shields down. Dooku is inviting them in. And as the ramp lowers and Obi-Wan steps forward, hand hovering over his lightsaber, we're left wondering, is this the first step toward peace, or the perfect setup for the most devastating betrayal of the war so far? The cruiser swallows their shuttle in cold blue light, and right away, we feel how wrong this is. No escort, no droid battalions marching, just an empty hangar echoing with every bootstep as Obi-Wan, a reformist senator, and a tiny squad of clones move forward under those flickering separatist lights. Now, there will be major spoilers for how this war could have ended very differently, so there's your warning. They're led through silent corridors into what used to be a meditation chamber, a repurposed temple from some forgotten world that Dooku has mounted to this neutral station. Statues are cracked, the walls are half lit by failing sconces, and in the center stands Dooku, cloak perfectly arranged, hands folded over his saber. Around him, just a handful of Magna Guards. No Grand Council, no battle droids, just a man who used to be a Jedi facing the order he left behind. The ideological clash starts almost immediately. Dooku doesn't waste time with pleasantries. He talks about the Senate drowning in corporate credits, about how the banking clan and the techno-union write the laws, while worlds on the rim starve. He points to the clones behind Obi-Wan and asks that old cutting question from the show. Is this what the Republic has come to? An army of slaves bred for war? Obi-Wan fires back. He lists the massacres on neutral worlds, the occupation of systems that tried to stay out of the conflict, the way separatist governors rule by fear. Our reformist senator jumps in too, naming specific contracts, tracing how both Quat and the Trade Federation profit every time a new fleet is commissioned. It's not just a duel of philosophy now, it's a spreadsheet of atrocities on both sides. Then Dooku does something different from the canon timeline. He leans in and admits that a shadow has been pulling strings over the entire war, that this figure sat in the heart of Coruscant and whispered to both factions. He mentions a Dark Lord who believed himself untouchable, until a beast reminded him otherwise. But he never says Sidious, never says Sith. He's testing them. Do the Jedi know about the chips? Do they suspect him? Obi-Wan's eyes narrow, but he doesn't bite. Here's our pattern interrupt. Instead of demanding surrender, Dooku offers structure. An armistice on key fronts, demilitarization zones around shipyards, and a joint commission of Jedi, separatist jurists, and neutral senators to hunt war profiteers. I thought it would be fun to frame this almost like a Twisted Peace Conference episode, because Dooku sells it as the first step toward a new, more balanced galactic order. Of course, no one fully trusts anyone. Obi-Wan quietly orders his squad to keep helmets recording. The senator insists on Senate ratification. Dooku demands that certain investigations avoid sensitive spiritual matters, which is a huge red flag. Now let's get started on the uncertainty. They part with a cautious agreement to more talks, but as the shuttle peels away from the station, Obi-Wan admits this could be either the beginning of peace, or the most elegant trap the Sith ever set, even after Sidious is gone. And in our next section, we'll see who moves first when word of this secret meeting starts to leak. Word spreads about that secret meeting faster than a Hutt hears about free credits. Within days, we're in this weird middle ground where the Clone Wars don't stop, but they don't feel the same either. Now let's get started on how the front actually cools without fully freezing. The first test ceasefires show up in systems that are exhausted more than ideological. Places like Christophsis, Ord Mantell, and even a couple of mid-rim mining worlds agree to stand-downs. Under a joint monitoring scheme, hammered out by Jedi negotiators and a few very nervous separatist diplomats, Republic and Separatist forces pull back to pre-agreed lines. Gunships stay grounded, munificent cruisers hold outside orbit, and for the first time in years, civilians are not propaganda backdrops, but the main reason to stop shooting. On the ground, this feels surreal. Clones who were used to hearing "For the Republic" over blaster fire are suddenly walking patrols along painted demarcation lines, staring at B-1s and B-2s doing the same awkward shuffle on the other side. There's this Umbara-style tension in the air, but without the constant artillery. Droids call across no man's land with their usual "Roger, Roger" jokes, and the clones fire back with their own gallows humor. Yet nobody actually pulls the trigger. They were trained to charge, not to wait. Of course, not everyone is happy about this new tempo. In the Senate, hardliners who had built their entire careers on no compromise with separatists suddenly see their speeches aging about as well as pre-Clone Wars battle droids. They accuse Maz Amedda's caretaker government and the Jedi of weakness, warning that any pause will just give Dooku time to regroup. On the CIS side, corporate leaders and firebrand governors claim that agreeing to local stand-downs makes their independence movement look soft, as if 3 years of total war weren't proof of commitment. As I said, this political backlash actually helps drive one of the biggest shifts. Because some battlefronts quiet down, the Jedi Council can finally reassign more masters and knights away from constant field command. We start to see more Jedi returning to Coruscant, not to sit in the temple and meditate, but to dig into things they should have questioned long ago. Kamino's contracts, the inhibitor chips, the original order for the clones, all of that suddenly moves from "we'll investigate after the war" to "we have just enough breathing room to look now." I thought it would be fun to highlight that their missions change too. Instead of only leading squads into meat grinder assaults, Jedi are dispatched as mediators to these ceasefire worlds, trying to turn temporary stand-downs into more formal truces. It's the closest they've been to their original mandate as peacekeepers since the war began, and that contrast is really important in this timeline. By the end of this phase, we're in a fragile balance. The war is still on, big fleets still maneuver, and there are plenty of systems where fighting never slows. But the overall intensity drops a notch, creating just enough space for hopeful reforms in the Senate and the Order, and at the same time, just enough darkness in the gaps for new conspiracies to grow. And in our next section, we'll see how the first major betrayal inside one of these ceasefire zones almost shatters the whole experiment overnight. That betrayal in the ceasefire zone doesn't just rattle nerves, it blows open the biggest secret of the entire war. Now, there will be major spoilers for the clones and for what their brains are actually wired to do, so there's your warning. The breakthrough doesn't come from one genius moment. It's this slow, ugly grind where patterns finally click. We have more tup moments showing up across the front. Elite troopers freezing mid-battle, hearing phantom voices, or firing at Jedi silhouettes before collapsing in confusion. Temple healers start comparing notes with Republic med droids, and what they find is terrifying. Every scan of a malfunctioning clone lights up the same spot deep in the brain, a dense little knot of tissue that doesn't match any Kaminoan growth chart. At first, they were told it was just part of the accelerated aging package, but as I said, once the healers meditate and really stretch out with the Force, they feel it. This thing is dead, cold, utterly inert in the living Force. It's not a natural mutation, it's an implant. The moment that word hits the council chamber, the room goes silent. We've seen Jedi sense droids and minds before. Now they're sensing the same wrongness inside their own troops. I thought it would be fun to trace the investigation like an episode in itself, because it really is a full detective arc. Shaak Ti leans on old Kaminoan contacts, Plo Koon escorts a medical team back to Tipoca City, and the clones in the escort squad start trading nervous jokes about having more in common with battle droids than we thought. Buried in half-deleted Kaminoan files, they uncover encrypted directives tied to one authorization key, the late Supreme Chancellor's. These files mention a contingency, broken up into sterile little phrases and numbers. Protocol 66. Jedi leadership neutralization. Good soldiers follow orders. When the Jedi slice through the code and line those terms up, the picture forms sickeningly fast. The chips are rigged to override free will at a spoken command, turning every clone into a sleeper assassin pointed straight at the order. The emotional fallout is brutal. Clones who sit in on the briefings come out shaking. Some rage, some go numb, some ask the question that hurts the most. Were their medals, their friendships, their loyalty, ever really theirs? A few quote Five's old warnings, and suddenly that paranoid ARC doesn't sound so crazy. Now let's get started on the response. Quietly, under the cover of routine medical rotations, the Jedi and Republic doctors begin a chip removal program. They start with ARC troopers, commandos, and temple guards, then plan to fan out to entire legions. It becomes a race against a voice that might never speak again, or might already be echoing from somewhere else in the galaxy. And in the next section, we'll see what happens when someone tries to finish the job Palpatine started. So, someone does try to finish the job. It just isn't a Sith Lord whispering, "Execute Order 66." It's a Kaminoan technician, a panicked admiral, a corrupt senator, all poking at a system they barely understand. And for the first time, the clones are watching them back. The moment the rank and file learn about the chips, the room changes. These are soldiers who already joke that they're born to follow orders, so hearing there was literally a kill switch in their heads hits hard. Some troopers quietly pack their kits and talk about disappearing to some outer rim farm, pulling a cut Lockwayne and walking away from the whole war. Others do the opposite. They march straight to their Jedi generals and say, "I'm staying, but this time it's because I choose to." Now, let's get started with specific squads, because this is where it really feels different from the original timeline. The 501st goes first through the chip removal program. Rex, Echo, Kix, Jesse, they were already close to Anakin and Ahsoka, and now they become the test case. We can almost hear Fives in the back of Rex's mind as he signs the consent form. Rex comes out of surgery and becomes one of the loudest voices telling his brothers, "You deserve to know what's in your head before you go back to the front." The 212th follows. Cody wakes up from his own procedure, reads the medical brief on contingency protocols, and it's a punch in the gut. He's the good soldier, the one who does everything by the book, and the book just tried to turn him into a Jedi assassin. So he leans into that same discipline and starts organizing briefings, pushing commanders to document informed consent, insisting that no clone be forced onto a transport without knowing the risks. As I said, they were bred for obedience, but now they're practicing leadership. Here's the pattern interrupt. The Republic actually admits what happened, sort of. A classified report circulates through the Senate, acknowledging that a biochip was used without proper disclosure. Publicly, they blame a Kaminoan oversight. Privately, the Jedi Council is furious. I thought it would be fun to contrast this with Shaak Ti's earlier faith in Kamino's process, because now she's at the front of a movement for a clone rights charter. The Jedi start arguing in formal sessions that clones are sentient beings with the right to refuse experimental procedures, the right to property, even the right to retirement. Kamino does not take this well. Lama Su and Nala Se push back, insisting the clones are commissioned assets. Some senators seize on the scandal for their own agendas, saying this proves mass-produced soldiers are a moral and strategic liability. They call for phasing out new batches in favor of volunteer armies or more droids once the war ends. For a species that built its entire economy on cloning, that's an existential threat. By the final months of the war, the vibe on the front lines is completely different. The clones still fight, but they're not hidden time bombs waiting for a code phrase. They are soldiers who signed off on the risks, who removed the worst of the programming, and who are starting to imagine a future that isn't just the next deployment. That creates a very different foundation for post-war society, and in the next section, we'll see who tries to shape that future once the shooting finally stops. So with the chips exposed and the clones finally feeling like people instead of walking Order 66 triggers, the spotlight swings right back onto the Jedi. If the soldiers were almost turned into a murder squad without even knowing it, what does that say about the generals who never saw it coming? The Council has to sit with that. Now, there will be major spoilers for the Jedi's ego here, so there's your warning. In meditation chambers that once echoed with calm certainty, we now see Yoda, Mace, Plo Koon, and the others admitting out loud that their entanglement in politics and war nearly destroyed them. They were so busy being generals, voting in the Senate, and sitting in Palpatine's office that a hidden Sith plan grew right under their noses. That realization pushes real reform, not just another stern lecture to the younglings. The first big shift is attachments. They don't suddenly say, go get married, have 3 kids, and a droid dog, but the strictest rules soften. Counselors start teaching how to manage love and fear instead of pretending those emotions don't exist. Anakin standing there with Ahsoka and Rex is suddenly less of an awkward exception and more of a model. Bonds can be dangerous, but they also stop the clones from becoming mindless executioners. At the same time, the training focus changes. Instead of every promising knight getting fast-tracked to battlefield command, the Order re-emphasizes meditation, diplomacy, and investigation. I thought it would be fun to imagine a whole new branch of Jedi whose job is basically galactic oversight. They dig into military contracts, monitor emergency powers, and follow up on anything that smells like another inhibitor chip situation. It's the Jedi as watchdogs, not attack dogs. Of course, that shift is not smooth. Older masters who fought through Geonosis and the early brutal episodes of the war struggled to adapt. For them, the Order's old code carried them through decades of service. But knights like Anakin, Ahsoka, Obi-Wan, even someone like Quinlan Vos, see this as validation that the Order has to evolve to stay relevant and compassionate. As I said, these are the people who already bent rules for clones, civilians, and friends. Now the institution is finally catching up to what they were doing in the field. Out in the Republic, public perception stays split. Many citizens still blame the Jedi for prolonging the war and forever trusting a Chancellor who weaponized a Zillo beast. Others, especially those who heard about the chips and the near miss with authoritarian rule, start to see the Jedi as crucial overseers who caught the conspiracy just in time. Now let's get started setting up the post-war galaxy. The Order is bruised but not broken, standing on the edge of a future where it might finally become a balanced guardian of peace, instead of an unwitting tool of the Sith. And in the next part, we'll see who tries to shape that fragile new status quo once the shooting stops for real. Now that the Jedi have ripped the lid off the chip conspiracy and the shooting is slowing down, we have to talk about the one person who built this whole war from the other side, Count Dooku. The timeline has shifted under his feet, and for the first time since he walked away from the Order, his grand design is slipping out of his control. As ceasefires spread and Kaminoan facilities are quietly repurposed to remove inhibitor chips, Dooku starts getting reports that sound like a bad holodrama. Clone battalions refusing illegal orders, Republic admirals opening channels to separatist commanders instead of firing. Systems that were supposed to be worn down into accepting an empire are instead talking about reform. The very tools Sidious intended to use to break the Jedi are being dismantled piece by piece, while the Zillo Beast's rampage is still fresh in everyone's mind. So now Dooku faces a brutal fork in the road. He can double down on the war, drive General Grievous and the droid armies harder than ever, and try to force his separatist vision through sheer violence. Or he can do the unthinkable for a Sith Lord, step into the light of public truth, expose the entire Sidious plot, and risk being destroyed in the hope that something more honest rises from the ashes. As I said, this is the man who once stood in the Jedi Council chambers, The tragedy is that it took a dead Chancellor and a freed clone army to make him really look in the mirror. I thought it would be fun to stage his final choice on a battlefield that's already burned itself out. Picture a scarred Outer Rim world, walkers frozen in place, droid tanks half sunken in craters, and white armored clones standing opposite B1s with their rifles pointed down. In the middle, under a flickering shield generator, Dooku walks out to meet a small Jedi squad: Obi-Wan, a recovered Shock Tie, and a handful of commanders who personally lived through the chip removals. Now, there will be major spoilers for Dooku's dignity here, so there's your warning. He doesn't just gloat, he talks. He lays out Sidious's design in chilling, methodical detail: the inhibitor chips, the Hidden Order 66 command, the plan to brand the Jedi as traitors and replace the Republic with a safe empire. The Jedi don't look surprised. They were already halfway there from Fives' legacy and their own investigation. What they needed was a Sith Lord confirming they weren't just seeing ghosts. Of course, not everyone on that field wants peace. While Dooku is still speaking, Grievous storms in with the vanguard, roaring that his master has betrayed the cause. The general has heard enough whispered reports to know something has changed, and seeing Dooku stand unarmed beside Jedi is all the proof he needs. Blaster fire erupts as clone hardliners and separatist extremists both decide this negotiation is treason. Here's the key moment. Dooku could survive. He feels the danger before it hits. He could ignite his saber, cut down clones and droids alike, and vanish into the smoke. Instead, he does what he never did when he left the Order. He accepts the cost of his choices. He shoves Obi-Wan clear of a tank round, twists just enough to keep Grievous's fire focused on him, and then simply stops defending. A spray of bolts from droids and clones cross in the chaos, and the Count of Sereno falls, cloak burning, saber extinguished. Is that full redemption? Not really. He dies a Sith who finally admits he was a pawn, not a secret hero. But his last words, recorded by multiple helmets and tactical droids, are enough. The revelation that both sides were engineered into this conflict hits the HoloNet within days, and suddenly senators, planetary leaders, and even some corporate heads are calling the war itself a crime. Peace talks that would have taken years of grinding attrition now accelerate in weeks. Now, let's get started setting up the real post-war scramble. Because with Sidious dead, Dooku gone, and the chips exposed, the biggest question left is who dares to pick up the pieces of a galaxy that just realized it's been played, and what new powers are already moving in the shadows to claim that empty throne. So once the political house of cards starts collapsing, the galaxy does what it always does in a crisis. It looks for a monster to blame. With Sidious gone, Dooku exposed or dead depending on your preferred timeline branch, and the chip scandal blowing up on the HoloNet, General Grievous becomes that monster. He's not a shadowy Sith mastermind now. He's the very loud, very visible face of every burned world and every shattered clone squad. Republic broadcasts start running his attacks on repeat. Separatist worlds, exhausted by constant victories that only bring more reprisals, begin to see him as the main obstacle to any kind of peace. Even in CIS space, governors whisper that as long as Grievous is out there, the Jedi will never stop coming. As I said, the war suddenly has a single, terrifying target, so the hunt for Grievous becomes the new organizing principle of the endgame. I thought it would be fun to frame this almost like a reverse Order 66. Instead of clones suddenly turning on Jedi, we see Jedi and clones deliberately teaming up with disillusioned separatist commanders to track one cyborg warlord across the Outer Rim. There's even room for those "hello there" style running jokes as reports come in of Obi-Wan showing up on world after world, always just missing his quarry. Eventually, they corner him, not on Utapau under the shadow of a secret order, but on a fortress world he's converted into a personal throne of scrap. Picture a spider-like shipyard built from the wreckage of 100 destroyed cruisers. Obi-Wan leads the assault, but this time he's flanked by clone battalions whose chips have been removed, and by separatist defectors bringing codes, layouts, and, in one great pattern interrupt, entire droid battalions that refuse to fire after their tactical droids reprogram them mid-battle. The fight becomes less about one Jedi versus one general and more about the symbolism. Grievous represents droid supremacy and endless escalation. Obi-Wan represents cooperation between former enemies. When Grievous finally falls, still coughing, still snarling about Jedi treachery, It lands as the moment everyone realizes the shooting war can actually stop. Now, there will be major spoilers for the corporate side of the CIS, so there's your warning. Without Sith guidance, the Trade Federation, Techno Union, Banking Clan, and planetary leaders start doing what they do best, cutting deals. Some worlds negotiate demilitarization in exchange for local autonomy, others hand over factories, shipyards, and whole droid control networks in return for amnesty. That leads directly to the fate of the droid armies. Under the armistice terms, huge numbers are deactivated and warehoused, but not all of them. On safer worlds, B1s and B2s are rebranded for reconstruction, mining, and hazardous cleanup. That raises uncomfortable questions. If clones who were bred for war can push for rights, what about droids that can learn, joke, and disobey? The formal armistice that follows doesn't feel like a triumphant parade. It's more of a weary, galaxy-spanning exhale. Large-scale battles stop, but local grudges, black market droid armies, and rogue admirals still simmer in the background, waiting for the next generation of storytellers and warlords to decide what the post-Grievous galaxy really looks like. Now, let's get started on how that uneasy peace reshapes the Jedi and the clones when the war that defined them suddenly ends without an empire to step into its place. So, we've got this war that suddenly loses its puppet master, but the guns don't just fall silent out of respect for the Zillo beast. The first big consequence of Palpatine's death is actually pretty simple. There's no one with the power, or the sheer will, to drag the Republic over the line into an empire. The galaxy still craves stability after years of chaos, but now it has to negotiate it instead of having it imposed. The Senate reacts the only way a terrified legislature can. They freeze. Masameda tries to step in as acting Chancellor, but without Sidious whispering in his ear, he's more bureaucrat than would-be Emperor. The Jedi, already on Coruscant because of the Beast Crisis, push for something different. I thought it would be fun to frame this as their post-war simulation, almost like a political version of a Camino training room. If the last Supreme Chancellor died mid-battle, what safeguards would you wish you'd had? So the first reform is term limits. The office of Chancellor, which had become this almost monarchic position under Palpatine, is capped to a single extended term, with no emergency re-election loopholes. On top of that, emergency powers now come with hard timers and mandatory reviews. Every extraordinary decree has to be renewed by a supermajority of the full Senate and by a new network of regional councils. Or it just expires. As I said, the whole point is to make sure no one person on Coruscant can turn a crisis into a permanent crown. Those regional councils are the second big change. Instead of everything flowing through one city planet, major sectors get formal assemblies made up of local senators, planetary leaders, and even guild reps. Think of it as the Republic admitting that the Midrim and Outer Rim aren't just background extras in a Coruscant episode. They were given real authority over security, reconstruction funds, and trade patrols, with the central government coordinating rather than commanding. Now, there will be major spoilers for the Jedi's political future here, so there's your warning. In this timeline, the Order doesn't get wiped out, but they also don't walk away unchanged. The Senate writes them into the Constitution as an independent, accountable order. The Jedi Council gets a permanent advisory seat on a new security oversight board, but Jedi are explicitly barred from holding elected office or commanding clone units without civilian sign-off. That compromise pleases no one completely, which is exactly why it sticks. Some core worlds, still stung by years of Jedi generals, resent any formal influence at all. Former separatist systems argue for almost Confederate-level autonomy, demanding that their droid demilitarization be matched by clone drawdowns and tax concessions. A few key ex-CIS worlds negotiate special status, keeping tighter control over local defense fleets and courts in exchange for rejoining. The result is a republic that's imperfect and fragile, but crucially, not an empire. Its flaws are the kind you debate, filibuster, and reform, not the kind you enforce at blaster point behind a stormtrooper helmet. And that sets the stage for our next question. What happens to the clones and the Jedi when the war ends, but the institutions built around them refuse to go quietly? So, if the Republic doesn't slide into an empire, that leaves us with one huge, uncomfortable question. What happens to the clones when the shooting stops? Their entire lives were built around a war that, in this timeline, actually ends without Order 66, without Stormtrooper armor, without Sidious pulling the strings from the shadows. Demobilization becomes the crisis nobody on Coruscant is really prepared for. Overnight, The Senate is staring at millions of genetically accelerated soldiers whose original purpose has been fulfilled. They were grown to fight, trained to obey, and of course, designed to age out fast. Now, are they veterans, temporary assets, or something closer to disposable property? The Kaminoan contracts, all that fine print Lamassu loved to wave around, suddenly matter a lot more than anyone expected. I thought it would be fun to zoom in on those debates, because this is where the politics get very real. One block of senators, led by people who actually served with Jedi and clones on the front, pushes for retirement benefits, basic pensions, and a clear path to full citizenship. Others argue for keeping a reduced clone garrison as peacekeepers, scattered across key worlds as a stabilizing force, while separatist holdouts are hunted down. And then there are the dark voices, the ones quoting cost efficiency reports, quietly suggesting you can just not renew the Camino contracts, or even sell clone units to member worlds as security packages. Now, there will be major spoilers for some of the emotional beats we've seen with characters like Cut Lawquane and Rex, so there's your warning. Those canon stories become the template the clones themselves point to, organized by respected commanders. The veterans form their own associations, almost a new kind of squad, but political instead of military. They testify in the Senate, stand in armor in the public galleries, and use the inhibitor chip revelations as their moral high ground. If they were forced to almost kill the Jedi against their will, then, as I said, they deserve a say in who they get to be now. The outcomes are messy and varied. Some clones accept offers to become local security officers on worlds that saw them as heroes during the war. You get entire precincts where the sergeant still calls everyone shiny, as a joke. Others take land grants on frontier planets, turning decommissioned outposts into farms and townships in a very Cut Lawquane, but on purpose way. A select few join Jedi-led missions as civilian allies, not programmed subordinates, flying gunships or advising on tactics, when a peacekeeping operation could still turn into a firefight. Now, let's get started on the emotional part. The clones finally gain a measure of self-determination, but it's bittersweet. They're aging fast, wrestling with identities that were literally printed on a Kaminoan assembly line, and walking through a galaxy that wants to move on from the war every time it sees their faces. And just when it seems like they've found fragile peace, something new appears on the horizon that forces them to decide who they really are, without a war to define them. So now we zoom in on the biggest wildcard of this whole timeline, Anakin Skywalker trying to live in a galaxy that actually survives the Clone Wars. Without Vader, without a purge, he doesn't disappear into legend or nightmare. He's still there, walking the halls of the Temple, one of the most powerful Jedi who ever lived, and one of the most controversial. The Council can't ignore him. He's the hero of the Outer Rim sieges, the guy clones and senators quote when they talk about winning the impossible battles. But he's also the knight who argued with masters in front of the whole squad, who broke rules when they got in the way of saving people. So there's your warning. Post-war Anakin is not a calm, robed librarian. He's a reformer from within, pushing for change every time the Order slips back into old habits. Now, let's get started with his role in the rebuilt Jedi Order. Anakin eventually takes on more students, not just one Padawan. He's the master who volunteers for the problem cases, the kids who struggle with fear or anger, because he remembers being that kid. Training with him looks different. Missions double as lessons, he lets clones and civilians speak in front of younglings, and he uses his own failures as case studies. When a Padawan panics in a simulation, he doesn't just say, "There is no emotion, there is peace." He tells them about Geonosis, about almost losing Obi-Wan, and how he learned to act through the fear instead of pretending it wasn't there. Of course, we have to talk about Ahsoka. In this version of the timeline, she still walks away from the Order at some point, because the flaws that pushed her out are deep. But the difference is that the Temple doesn't become a tomb afterward. There's no Order 66, no Empire hunting her, and the reforms Anakin fights for make it a lot easier for her to stay in contact. They were master and apprentice once. Now they're more like two stubborn generals comparing notes. I thought it would be fun to imagine an episode where she returns to teach a special tactics seminar, trading Sky Guy and Snips jabs, while a room full of wide-eyed Padawans watches. That softer, post-war Order also handles his secret marriage very differently. The attachment rule is still there, but the Council has been humbled by the war and by the clones' loyalty. They can't pretend emotions don't exist, so when Padme and Anakin finally stop hiding, it doesn't blow everything up. It becomes a carefully managed, semi-public relationship. Officially, he's a Jedi liaison to the Senate. Unofficially, everyone knows the hero with no fear goes home to the most famous senator in the Republic. As I said, that honesty feeds back into how he trains others. He pushes for more flexible, empathetic methods, arguing that the old way, taking children, cutting them off, and demanding serenity, nearly broke him. Younglings in this era still learn discipline, but they also learn to talk about nightmares, about anger, about loss. The Order becomes a place where you bring your fear to the Masters instead of hiding it from them. Now, there will be major spoilers for Anakin's fate and a lot of other what-ifs, but here we leave him unresolved. He's still a storm under control, capable of incredible heroism and terrible mistakes. The difference is that the structures around him aren't as brittle. There are more voices to pull him back from the edge. Ahsoka challenging him, Obi-Wan steadying him, Padme calling out his absolutism, a council that actually listens. Does he someday sit on that council? Does he burn out and walk away? We don't know. And that uncertainty is the point. In this timeline, Anakin Skywalker finally has the space to choose the light more than once, not just in a single redemptive moment at the very end. And that's where the real twist of this timeline settles in, because once Anakin finally has room to choose the light, we can zoom back out and see the thing that accidentally gave him that space in the first place, the Zillo beast. Now, let's get started with the long tail of that one rampage on Coruscant. In the years after Palpatine's death, Republic scientists keep working off the secret notes he left behind. They were never able to recreate full Zillo armor plating, and cloning an entire new beast proves impossible, but they do adapt the principles. Starfighter hulls get layered microscales, certain Venator-class cruisers test segmented dorsal plates, and elite squads on the front get specialized shields that can shrug off heavier cannon fire than before. As I said, this never becomes the mass-produced, super soldier armor Palpatine dreamed of. It's expensive, finicky, and any attempt to scale it up runs into the same problem the Chancellor did. The material wants to be stubborn. You can almost hear some Kaminoan muttering. The subject resists compliance, and shutting a datapad in frustration. So instead of a legion of unstoppable stormtroopers, the Zillo legacy shows up in a few prototype starfighters, a handful of Jedi shuttle refits, and classified armor plating around key Senate vaults. Culturally, though, the Zillo beast grows way bigger than its physical remains. Holodramas turn that Coruscant attack into the definitive Nature's Revenge episode of the war. We get theatrical posters of the beast looming over the Senate dome, Palpatine's tiny figure in its shadow, and titles like The Monster That Ate the Empire, even though, of course, the Empire never happens here. In history lectures, his death becomes the go-to cautionary tale. The Chancellor who tried to weaponize everything, even a living force of nature, and paid the price. And because this is the Star Wars galaxy, where every legend attracts the wrong kind of attention, the Zillo legacy has a darker side. Black market groups start paying ridiculous credits for even trace Zillo samples. Rogue states in the Outer Rim raid old labs, hoping to reverse engineer that armor. Every few years, we get a crisis. A shield test that goes out of control, a pirate gang with a gunboat that standard turbolasers can't crack, a research station venting to the Senate. Our containment has failed. Those are the episodes where veteran clones and Jedi both go very quiet when someone says the word Zillo. I thought it would be fun to leave the door open here, because the galaxy absolutely would. In Deep Republic archives, there are sealed files on Project Scales. Out in the unknown regions, there are rumors of a derelict Kaminoan ship still broadcasting faint biosigns from its cargo holds. Are they failed clones? Are they eggs? So, there's your warning. In a future era, some overconfident warlord or curious explorer could stumble on the monster that already changed history once. In the end, the Zillo beast stops being just a rampaging creature from one Clone Wars episode. It becomes the accidental catalyst that saved the galaxy from an empire by killing the one man who thought he could control everything. And that shadow hangs over every decision the post-war Republic makes about power, the Force, and what they dare to turn into a weapon next. So now that we've watched the Zillo beast accidentally decapitate the Sith's master plan, we can finally ask, in this messier timeline, who actually comes out ahead? I thought it would be fun to treat this almost like a post-war scoreboard, because the winners and losers here look very different from what we know in canon. The clearest winners are the Jedi. Without Order 66, there's no Temple Massacre, no Purge, no hunted survivors scraping by in the shadows. But that doesn't mean they were fine. The Council has to confront how they were turned into generals, how they missed Sidious right under their noses, and how close they came to becoming the very authoritarian force they were supposed to resist. So, instead of extinction, we get painful reform. Fewer child soldiers, more knights stationed among regular citizens, and a real debate about attachment and prophecy that Anakin is forced to sit in on, not run from. Right behind them, the clones finally stop being disposable assets on a secret timer. The inhibitor chips are still there, of course, but with no Execute Order 66 coming through, they're just unexploded bombs in the medical charts. Once 5-style questions start popping up, the Senate and the Jedi dig in. Kaminoan contracts are dragged into the light, the chips are removed, and regiments that were destined to become faceless stormtroopers now get pensions, names on voting rolls, and, in some cases, seats in local security forces. It's not perfect, but it's a future, not a death sentence. Politically, reformist senators finally get some traction. Padme, Bail, Mon Mothma, and their whole loyalist committee crowd use the shock of the Chancellor's death to slam the brakes on emergency powers. Wartime surveillance laws sunset instead of stacking up. Masa Meta tries to keep the machine running, but without Sidious whispering in his ear, he's more bureaucrat than puppet master, and the Senate eventually drifts back towards something resembling a real republic. On the Separatist side, we get partial winners. Their worlds avoid the Scorched Earth campaigns and orbital bombardments we see hinted at in legends about the late Clone Wars. No Death Star means no Alderaan moment, but to get peace, they were forced to compromise. Demilitarization clauses, war crimes tribunals, and a lot of Trade Federation neutrality licenses getting shredded on the Senate floor. Dooku dies, but he dies not as the cackling villain on the Invisible Hand. He dies exposed as a fallen Jedi, confronted by Obi-Wan and Anakin, and offered one last chance to tell the truth about Darth Sidious before he goes. That makes Anakin himself a sort of tragic winner. He never becomes Vader, never gets the suit, never walks through the temple cutting down younglings. But his fear of loss, his anger at the Council, and his sense that the Jedi failed him don't vanish overnight. Instead of being weaponized by a Sith Master, those flaws are dragged into the open during the post-war reforms. Now, there will be major spoilers for Anakin's emotional life here, so there's your warning. He still has visions, he still worries about Padme, he still resents rules he doesn't fully understand. The difference is, there's no single voice pushing him toward the dark. There's a whole order trying, imperfectly, to pull him back. Then we hit the surprising losers. War profiteers who thought this conflict would go on forever suddenly find their best customer dead. Quat drive yards, the banking clan, the techno union, they were all gearing up for a long, profitable grind, not a shaky armistice. Kamino's pristine reputation takes a direct hit once the chips and the contingency orders are exposed on the Senate floor. The whole, we just grew what the Republic asked for defense does not hold up when Shaak Ti and a squad of very angry clones testify about secret programming. Hardline militarists on both sides lose big as well. In the Republic, the Tarkin-style officers who wanted a permanent war footing and tighter security state find their arguments undercut by the very chaos Sidious left behind. On the Separatist side, Grievous and the more fanatical commanders who dreamed of total victory suddenly look outdated in a galaxy that's exhausted and wants trade routes, not superweapons. Their with us or against us rhetoric lands a lot worse when both the Jedi and moderate senators are publicly saying, "No, really, we were being played by one Sith Lord the whole time." And that's the real comparison to canon. So many horrors we think of as inevitable, the Jedi Purge, the rise of the Empire, the Death Star, turn out to be the product of one man's secret, meticulously engineered plan. Remove him early with one rampaging Zillo beast, and the galaxy doesn't turn into a utopia. Corruption still exists, old grudges still burn, and the Force is still out of balance. But the worst nightmares never crystallize into institutions. So, as I said, this leaves us with a big question. Is this chaotic, more democratic, more uncertain galaxy actually closer to what the Jedi and the Republic were supposed to protect in the first place? Now, let's get started on what that means for the future of the Sith, because the dark side never really stays gone for long. So, if the dark side never really stays gone, what does that look like without an emperor sitting on a throne? In this timeline, we don't get a clean, happily ever after, where the Force just snaps back into balance. We get lingering shadows instead, and I thought it would be fun to walk through what those actually are. First, the Sith legacy doesn't just evaporate because one Zillo beast stomped on one old man in a robe. Holocrons are still buried in forgotten temples, Sith cults still whisper on worlds like Exegol and Moribond, and scattered dark side adepts pick up fragments of teachings. Now, there will be major spoilers for a lot of obscure lore here, so there's your warning. Some of these adepts have heard garbled rumors of a grand plan that almost worked. A Sith Lord who controlled both sides of the Clone Wars and nearly turned a democracy into an empire overnight. That legend becomes a twisted inspiration, a sort of Order 66 that never was, fueling new fanatics who want to finish what they think Sidious started. Politically, the temptation doesn't die with him either. Future chancellors and sector governors still study the Clone Wars era and see one thing: emergency powers work. Palpatine's playbook is still in the archives. Unlimited terms, centralized command over the clones, direct control of the courts, all of that becomes a cautionary tale on paper, but a secret blueprint in practice. During later crises, we see leaders push for temporary security acts or special clone deployment rights. And even if they can't quite replicate his exact timeline, they echo it enough that the Senate has to fight off those overreaches again and again. That's where the reformed Jedi Order changes the most. After coming so close to being wiped out without even realizing there was a Sith Master behind the curtain, they were never that complacent again. The Council dedicates whole squads of Jedi and researchers to tracking early signs of tyranny and dark side corruption, almost like political sentinels. They study Sidious's rise, Dooku's fall, even Krell's betrayal on Umbara, and build a kind of checklist: secret armies, propaganda, cults around strong leaders. When they see those patterns, they intervene earlier, sometimes clashing with systems that insist, "We're nothing like the old empire, that never happened." But here's the pattern interrupt. The real threat often isn't on Coruscant at all. It's out on the borders. In former separatist space, regional strongmen and crime syndicates rush into the power vacuum. Think Hutt Khajiits, droid warlords reactivating old factories, or clone deserters being hired as elite enforcers. Whole sectors fall under localized tyrannies, brutal little mini-empires that show us what Sidious's vision would have looked like on a smaller, more chaotic scale. So, as I said, killing Sidious with a Zillo beast didn't banish evil from the galaxy. It just prevented one very specific nightmare from becoming the official script. Now the galaxy has to wrestle with its own choices, without an emperor dictating every move, and our next step is to see who actually steps up in that vacuum. The Jedi, the clones, or someone much darker. Now, let's talk about whether this branch of the timeline actually holds up inside canon, because it's one thing to say, the Zillo beast crushes Sidious, and another to make that feel earned. The Clone Wars already shows us how reckless Palpatine is with this creature. He drags it to Coruscant, ignores the Kaminoans' warnings, and stands on exposed platforms, while a nigh-indestructible monster tears through the capital. That's not us inventing danger, that's on screen. Physically, the kill is totally plausible. The Zillo beast shrugs off ATTE fire, resists gas, and tanks lightsaber strikes. During the Coruscant rampage, it gets close enough to SWAT gunships and loom right over the Chancellor's building. All we've done is tighten the chaos. One missed evac shuttle, one collapsing platform, and the one creature that canonically terrifies him finally reaches the one man arrogant enough to think he can domesticate it. As I said, this is overconfidence, not plot armor, failing. Now, there will be major spoilers for character behavior across the Clone Wars, so there's your warning. In our branch, Masameda moving to stabilize the Senate is actually very in character. In canon, he becomes the public face of the Empire's bureaucracy, the guy still standing next to the throne in the Darth Vader comics. Here, without a Sith Master, he just leans harder into procedure and emergency continuity instead of full-blown dictatorship. Dooku's reaction also tracks. He was already disillusioned with the Republic before Sidious recruited him, and we hear in the Lost Missions that he's not thrilled about being a pawn. Remove Sidious, and he doesn't suddenly become a reformer, he just loses the grand, coordinated Order 66 endgame. So he falls back on what he knows: separatist pressure, targeted strikes, trying to force negotiations rather than executing a perfect Jedi purge he no longer has the tools for. The Jedi and Anakin now stay consistent too. We've already seen the Council doubt the war in episodes like Heroes on Both Sides, and we've watched Anakin push back against authority on Umbara and in the Citadel arc. Take away Sidious's constant emotional manipulation and secret grooming, and his choices skew toward reckless heroism rather than outright fall. He's still volatile, but not automatically Darth Vader. Some people will argue that another Sith would just rise, or that the Republic was doomed to collapse anyway. That's a fair question, but we've seeded stabilizing factors the show itself hints at. Clone autonomy in arcs with fives and the inhibitor chips, Senate reformers like Padme and Bail pushing anti-corruption bills, and Jedi already questioning their role as generals. I thought it would be fun to lean into those threads and ask what happens if they're not all cut off by a single command. So, this what-if is speculative, of course, but it's built out of canon logic. It shows how fragile the Empire's rise really was, resting on one overconfident Sith surviving one monster attack. Now let's get started on who actually shapes the new order that follows. Now that we've seen who steps into the vacuum, we should talk about why this hits so differently on an emotional level. This isn't just a clever twist in the war's timeline. It turns one of the strangest Clone Wars episodes into the beating heart of a completely new story about hubris, second chances, and what happens when the inevitable actually isn't. The core irony is brutal and kind of perfect. The one creature in the galaxy that genuinely frightened Palpatine, the Zillo beast he wanted to dissect and clone for its armor, becomes the instrument of his downfall. He drags it to Coruscant as a secret weapon, orders the bombardment that tortures it, and in this version, that same decision literally tears his grand plan apart. His obsession with control creates the one variable he can't control, and there's a dark satisfaction in watching that play out. Because of that, the whole era becomes about second chances instead of sealed fates. The Jedi Council, who were so ready to compromise on ethics for security, now have to confront what their own war footing did to let a monster rampage through the capital. The clones, bred to follow orders without question, watch the command structure above them fracture before anyone can say execute Order 66. As I said, that buys them time to listen when a trooper like Fives starts talking about chips and manipulation, instead of dismissing him as unstable. Even Dooku's story bends towards something more complicated. With Sidious gone, he's not just the cackling holovillain, he's a disillusioned Jedi who suddenly realizes he was a pawn too. I thought it would be fun to lean into that and let him actually face Yoda or Obi-Wan without the invisible hand of his master, forcing everything toward Vader. Those meetings become second chances for everyone in the room, not just another step toward tragedy. For fans, there's real catharsis here. We remember Fives dying in an alley on Coruscant, Ahsoka walking away from the Order, whole squads of clones and Jedi wiped out because the script demanded an empire. In this version, their pain still matters, but it leads somewhere. Fives' warnings can be investigated. Ahsoka's departure can spark reforms instead of being a sad prelude to a purge. The war is still ugly, of course, but the sense of total inevitability is gone. That ties into one of Star Wars' biggest themes. Destiny is shaped by choices, not by some locked-in canon checklist. Remove one manipulator, and suddenly 1,000 small acts of courage and compassion actually change the outcome. A clone refusing a bad order, a senator blocking an emergency power grab, a Jedi choosing mercy over spectacle. In this timeline, those moments don't get buried under Sidious's master plan. Now, there will be major spoilers as we follow those choices through, so there's your warning. What does a galaxy look like that's still messy and imperfect, but where the worst horrors were averted by a freak Zillo rampage, and the hard work that followed? Now let's get started on who pays the price for that miracle, and who refuses to. So now that we've walked through all those smaller choices, let's pull back and look at the whole alternate timeline we've built. From one angry Zillo roar on Coruscant, to a completely different galaxy at war's end. I thought it would be fun to trace that whole rampage ripple effect in one go, just to see how far one creature actually took us. As I said, everything diverged the moment Palpatine thought he could parade the Zillo beast across his capital and secretly weaponize its armor. Instead, the beast broke loose, tore through the Senate district, and in the chaos, the one being who terrified Sidious crushed him before he could ever say the words, "Execute Order 66." The Sith master plan died right there on the Plaza Stones, leaving the chips dormant, the war still raging, and almost no one understanding what they'd just been spared. From that vacuum, Mas Amedda stepped in as a kind of caretaker chancellor, trying to keep the Senate from imploding, while the Jedi Council suddenly found themselves as permanent advisors instead of soon-to-be fugitives. On the Separatist side, Dooku felt the leash snap. His master was gone, but the droid armies were still marching, and Grievous was still out there doing his best General Kenobi impression in reverse. Now, there will be major spoilers as we connect those threads, so there's your warning. We watched Dooku move from confident Sith apprentice to a man staring down a war he no longer fully believed in. Secret peace talks opened with Jedi negotiators, not because he turned into a hero, but because Sidious wasn't there to slam the door. In the middle of that, Five's nightmare became the galaxy's second chance. The inhibitor chips were finally found, studied without Sith interference, and removed. That one change meant clones could look at their generals and see commanders, not hardwired targets. Without Order 66 hanging over every battlefield, the war cooled instead of spiking into genocide. Dooku's last gambits failed, Grievous was hunted down and defeated as usual, but when the droid armies lost their leaders, they didn't turn into an excuse for total conquest. The CIS fractured into local systems and corporations, and instead of an empire rising from the ashes, an armistice forced both sides into demilitarization and ugly, drawn-out negotiations. The new status quo we ended up with is fragile, but very different. The Republic reformed its emergency powers, the Jedi Order survived and slowly evolved into a less militarized, more community-focused group, and the clones, freed from their chips, were granted rights, pensions, and actual futures beyond good soldiers follow orders. There's no Darth Vader stalking the shadows, no Imperial march over Coruscant, just a scarred galaxy trying to grow past the war. So the central idea here isn't that the Zillo beast magically fixed everything, it snapped the Sith chain at its weakest link, and then left everyone else to decide what to do with that breathing room. Now let's get started on what this brighter but still messy post-war order actually looks like, and which old threats might still be waiting out there in the dark. Now that we've snapped that Sith chain, this is where the what if really starts talking back to Star Wars itself. The saga loves to pretend Palpatine is this flawless mastermind, 10 steps ahead in every episode. But when we drop him under the shadow of the Zillo beast, we see what he really is at his core, a control freak whose whole timeline depends on every variable obeying him. Palpatine's plan only works if the war, the Senate, the Jedi, and the clones all move exactly where he wants. He designs secret orders and inhibitor chips. He scripts Dooku's defeats. He even tries to turn an ancient monster into custom armor. And yet, he underestimates the one thing he can't spreadsheet into submission. A living, terrified creature rampaging through Coruscant and the chaos of a real battle. As I said back in the canon Zillo Beast arc, he was already pushing his luck. Here, that luck finally runs out. That brings us to contingency. Star Wars is full of tiny moments that swing the whole galaxy. A torpedo down a thermal exhaust port. A single clone, Fives, almost exposing Order 66. A farm boy deciding to leave home. In this timeline, it's a monster's tail swipe, or a collapsing tower that ends the Sith's grand design. History, in Star Wars and in reality, doesn't just belong to the best planner. It belongs to whoever survives the random stuff that plan didn't cover. And this is where the institutions come in. The Republic and the Jedi almost fell, not just because one Sith was clever, but because their systems allowed that much power to concentrate in one office and one shadowy figure. Our what if forces them to confront that early. The Senate suddenly sees what it means that clones will follow a single voice without question. The Jedi suddenly have to ask why they trusted emergency powers at all. If they're smart, the lesson is clear. Never again let the whole squad, the whole galaxy, hinge on one person's word. I thought it would be fun to use this alternate timeline the same way we use something like the Domino Squad story. When we change the plot but keep the characters consistent, we're stress testing the moral and structural strengths of the universe. Does Yoda still choose patience? Does Anakin still struggle with attachment? Do the clones still show individuality once the script of Order 66 is ripped away? So there's your warning. This isn't just a monster kills Palpatine story. It's an invitation for us as fans to think critically and creatively about the stories we love, instead of assuming they were the only way things could have gone. Now, let's get started on how the Jedi, the Senate, and the clones actually try to rebuild a government when the supposed necessary evil is gone overnight. Now that we've laid out one possible version of this Zillo-triggered timeline, I thought it would be fun to hand the controls over to you for a bit. We've been following this as a straight chronological story, but of course every scene we just talked through could splinter into its own wild branch. Think back over what we've covered so far, and ask yourself, where did this whole thing feel the most fragile? Was it Dooku quietly hesitating when he realizes his master is gone and he doesn't have a grand Sith plan to hide behind anymore? Was it that first moment when the Kaminoan scientists start poking around the inhibitor chips without Sidious there to scare them into silence? Or was it in the Senate, when Mas Amedda and the Reformers are battling over emergency powers, and one more vote could have swung us right back toward an empire in different clothing? As I said, each of those is its own Order 66 level turning point. Now let's get started on the character-focused stuff, because this is where you all always come up with better ideas than I do. In this version of the war, which Jedi, clones, or senators do you think become the real main characters? Does Ahsoka hear the echoes of Five's warnings and decide to return to Coruscant as an independent investigator instead of an exile? Do the clones who were just soldiers in canon suddenly get to be politicians, with Rex or Echo pulling a Senator Jar Jar and accidentally becoming effective reformers? Or do we see someone entirely new flirting with the dark side in Palpatine's absence? A Jedi who can't handle the power vacuum and starts sounding a bit too much like Krell on Umbara? We also can't forget the actual star of this what if, the Zillo beast. In our main branch, it kills Palpatine and triggers the chaos, but what if it survives the aftermath? What if those secret cloning projects he ordered on Coruscant still go forward under someone much less ethical than the Jedi Council? A whole squad of Zillo armored super clones, or a single tamed beast used as a planetary deterrent, would tilt the balance of power all over again. Or maybe it becomes a symbol instead, a living reminder that indestructible tyrants can fall, the way people in canon quote, "I am no Jedi" after Ahsoka. Now, there will be major spoilers for the rest of Star Wars in the comments, so there's your warning, but I want you to connect this to other what-ifs too. How does a world where the Zillo beast ends Sidious intersect with Maul surviving Naboo, or with Mace actually killing Palpatine in the Chancellor's office, or even with Luke accepting Vader's offer on Cloud City? Do those timelines collide, or do they spin off into totally different galaxies of consequences? Treat the comments as our shared writer's room. Build on this foundation, challenge my assumptions, and write your own episodes in this altered Clone Wars. Because the real question now isn't just what happens after Palpatine dies, it's who steps up first when the next, even darker opportunity appears. So now, as we close out this branch of the war, I thought it would be fun to come back to the image that started it all. One towering shape on Coruscant. One impossible roar, shaking the Durasteel canyons. One clawed hand, bracing against the Senate building as the Zillo beast thrashes, and, without understanding what it's doing, knocks the most dangerous man in the galaxy off his throne before he can ever show his true face. That's the whole timeline in miniature. Star Wars is full of chosen ones, ancient prophecies, and thousand-year Sith plans, but it's also full of tiny messy moments where fate trips over a loose cable. A blaster bolt hits the wrong panel. A farm boy hesitates. A monster, dragged in chains across the stars, panics under the lights of the Capitol and ends up ending a dynasty before it begins. Now, there will be major spoilers baked into that idea if you carry it back into the main saga, so there's your warning. As I said, that balance is why this universe endures. We love the grand designs, the Rule of Two, the Clone Legions, the rise of the Empire, but we come back for the way individual choices and accidents keep punching holes in those designs. Domino Squad stumbling into heroism on Rishi, Fives nearly breaking the inhibitor chip conspiracy on Coruscant, and in this what if, a single beast turning Palpatine's perfect plan into rubble with one instinctive swipe. They were never meant to be the big players, but the story bends around them anyway. Now, let's get started on leaving this branch behind in the right way. You've walked with us from the Clone Wars through a future without Order 66, without Vader, without an Empire casting a shadow over every episode. That's decades of history we've just rethreaded, from Kaminoan labs to Senate debates and clone barracks. If you stayed through all of that, through every detour and squad-level decision, you've done exactly what the Jedi do in the archives. Sat with the holocron until it finished speaking. So the next time you rewatch the Clone Wars Zillo Beast arc, or you hit that Chancellor's office scene in Revenge of the Sith, let this branch sit just off-screen. When Mace Windu glares at Palpatine, imagine him remembering the day a creature's roar nearly rewrote destiny. When the clones snap to attention at Execute Order 66, remember that in one galaxy that command never comes, because the man who recorded it is already gone under falling Duracrete. In one galaxy, the Emperor rose. In this one, a beast roared, and the stars got a second chance. Close the holocron, let the projection fade, and carry that echo with you into the next story.